My name is Isabella Abrams, and I am 31 years old now. For the first 28 years of my life, I was a footnote in my own family's story, a shadow that simply proved the sun was shining on my sister. I was the quiet one, the plain one, the sensible one. But I never, ever imagined that the world's most famous poet, a man they called a modern Byron, would find his inspiration not in my sister's flawless light, but in my quiet, comfortable shade. This is the story of how a man who wrote about gods and monsters saw the soul I kept hidden from everyone, and in doing so, he taught me how to finally see it myself. Before I dive into the summer that changed everything, I want to hear from you. Let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you've ever felt invisible or been judged by a cover that wasn't of your own choosing, please hit that like button so I know I'm not alone. For all the new faces here, make sure you subscribe to join this wonderful community of storytellers and listeners. It truly means the world to me. The whole affair began, as so many things did in our family, with my sister Caroline. She had been born with the kind of beauty that stops conversations, a living, breathing work of art that our parents treated as a precious and delicate treasure. I was born 2 years later, with a quiet face, a love for dusty books, and an unfortunate tendency to speak the truth at inconvenient times. While Caroline was being fitted for gowns, I was hiding in the library. While she learned the art of the charming laugh, I learned the rhythms of iambic pentameter. Our paths were set from birth. She was destined to be admired, and I was destined to be, well, useful. That summer, our family had decamped to our country estate, a sprawling, slightly neglected house named Greywood Manor, bordered by ancient woods and a placid silver lake. The air was thick with the scent of honeysuckle and the promise of a long, lazy season. That promise was shattered on the second day by a piece of local gossip that sent my mother into a tizzy and my sister into a state of predatory bliss. Douglas Thorne had taken the old gamekeeper's cottage at the edge of our property. Douglas Thorne, the poet, the recluse, the tormented genius whose collections of poetry sold in the millions, whose dark, good looks were whispered about in every salon from London to Paris. He was a literary titan, and he had come to our quiet corner of the world, seeking solitude. My sister, however, saw it not as a request for privacy, but as a personal invitation. The campaign began almost immediately. Caroline treated Douglas Thorne's arrival not as a happy coincidence, but as destiny manifesting itself. She saw herself in the pages of his future work, a radiant muse immortalized in verse. "A poet needs beauty to inspire him, Isabella," she'd said, examining her perfect reflection in the hall mirror. "It is practically a duty to make myself available." My mother wholeheartedly agreed, and for the next week, Greywood Manor was transformed into a strategic command center for Operation Muse. Caroline's attacks were as subtle as a cavalry charge. On Monday, she donned a flowing white dress of gossamer silk and took a basket of perfectly arranged strawberries to his cottage. She reported back that he had been polite, remote, and had accepted the basket with a curt nod before closing the door. "He's shy," she'd concluded, undeterred. Men of such deep thoughts are often overwhelmed by true beauty at first. On Tuesday, she spent the afternoon reading a book of her own, a fashionable novel, held upside down on a chaise lounge she had our groundskeeper strategically place in a meadow visible from his cottage windows. She came back with a slight sunburn and no news. On Wednesday, she took to boating on the lake, trailing a lily-white hand in the water and arranging herself in poses she imagined were reminiscent of Arthurian legends. I watched from the library window, my stomach twisting with a familiar acidic mix of pity and second-hand embarrassment. It was all so transparent, so desperately staged. She wasn't trying to connect with a man. She was auditioning for a role. I felt a strange sort of protectiveness for the reclusive poet. He had come here to escape the world's clamor, and here was my sister, turning his sanctuary into a proscenium stage with an audience of one. My escape was the woods. The deep, ancient forest that bordered our estate was my sanctuary, a place where the light filtered down in soft, dappled patterns, and the only sounds were the rustle of leaves and the distant call of a cuckoo. It was a place where I didn't have to be Caroline's sister. I could just be Isabella. I often took a book with me, finding a comfortable seat on a bed of moss at the base of a great oak. That afternoon, I had brought a well-worn collection of John Donne's poetry. I was lost in the complex, breathtaking architecture of his verse, tracing the lines of a particularly dense metaphor with my finger when a twig snapped nearby. I looked up, startled, and my breath caught in my throat. It was him, Douglas Thorne. He was taller than in his photographs, and leaner, with an intensity in his dark eyes that the camera could never capture. His black hair was unruly, and his clothes were simple, functional, a stark contrast to the tormented aristocrat of the public's imagination. He looked less like a lord, and more like a scholar who had forgotten to eat. He had stopped dead, his expression one of profound annoyance, as if I were a trespasser in his private cathedral. "I'm sorry," I stammered, closing my book and starting to get up. "I didn't mean to disturb you. This is still part of my family's property, but I can go." "Don't," he said, his voice deeper and rougher than I'd expected. He took a step closer, his eyes not on my face, but on the book in my hands. His scowl lessened, replaced by a flicker of something I couldn't identify. Curiosity, perhaps. "Dawn," he stated. It wasn't a question. "Yes," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "The valediction forbidding mourning?" he asked, tilting his head. "I was just rereading it." He nodded slowly, his gaze still fixed on the worn leather cover. "A perfect poem, like a compass. Two souls, fixed and moving in concert." He looked up then, and for the first time, his eyes met mine. They were not dismissive, they were searching. Most people who carry books for show in these parts prefer something a little less formidable. The comment was a clear, if unintentional jab at my sister's performative reading. A small, traitorous smile touched my lips. "I don't read for show, I read to breathe." The words were out before I could stop them. It was too honest, too earnest. I expected him to mock me, or to simply turn and walk away. Instead, he took another step closer, his focus absolute. "Then tell me something. Miss Abrams, is it?" "The other Miss Abrams. Isabella," I supplied softly. "Isabella," he repeated, testing the name. "Tell me, Isabella. There's a line in my last collection, Ode to a Broken Astrolabe. The critics claimed the rust of fallen stars was a metaphor for disillusionment with fame. They were all quite pleased with themselves for figuring it out. What do you think it meant?" My heart began to pound. It was a test, a sudden terrifying test. I had read that collection until the pages were soft as cloth. I knew the poem intimately. I remembered the reviews, the self-congratulatory articles dissecting his genius, and I remembered thinking they were all wrong. "I don't think it was about fame," I said, my voice shaking slightly. "Fame is a modern complaint. That poem felt older. The astrolabe, it's a tool for measuring the heavens, for finding one's position by looking at something constant and true. I think the rust of fallen stars. It's the pain of discovering that the things you believed were constant and true can decay. It isn't about public opinion. It's about a private loss of faith." I finished, my cheeks burning, certain I had made a fool of myself. He stood perfectly still, the woods silent around us. The annoyed, reclusive poet was gone. In his place was a man who was looking at me, really looking at me, for the very first time. He wasn't seeing a plain face, or a simple dress. He wasn't seeing Caroline's sister. He was seeing someone who had read his words and understood the heart behind them. "A private loss of faith," he echoed, his voice soft with wonder. "Yes, that's it. That is precisely it." He didn't smile. Not exactly, but the hard lines of his face softened. "You're the first person to have said that." In that moment, something shifted between us. It wasn't romance, not yet. It was something rarer, and to me, far more precious. It was recognition. In the quiet of the woods, the man who was famous for his words had fallen silent, captivated by mine. That brief, intense encounter in the woods changed the texture of the summer. Douglas Thorne did not suddenly start accepting my family's dinner invitations or paying court to Caroline. In fact, he seemed to retreat even further, his cottage door remaining stubbornly closed. Caroline was perplexed. Her campaign had met with utter silence. She redoubled her efforts, her lakeside poses becoming more dramatic, her accidental strolls past his garden more frequent. She was operating from a playbook that had always worked, a belief system where beauty was the master key that unlocked all doors. His indifference was not just a rejection, but a violation of the natural order of her world. "It's very odd," she mused one evening, examining her fingernails, as if they held the answer. "Perhaps he's intimidated. Or maybe he's one of those artists who prefers to worship from afar before making his move." My mother nodded sagely. "A man like that is a prize to be won, dear. He is testing your resolve." I remained silent, a custodian of my secret knowledge. I knew it wasn't about resolve or distance. It was about language. My sister was speaking in prose, and he was listening for poetry. She offered him the polished surface of a gemstone, and he was searching for the fire at its core. My own encounters with him became a series of quiet coincidences that felt anything but coincidental. A few days after our meeting in the forest, I went to the small, dusty bookshop in the nearby village. I was in the back, running my fingers over the spines of forgotten history tomes, when his voice came from directly behind me. "Looking for anything in particular, Isabella?" I turned, my heart giving a familiar lurch. He was leaning against a bookshelf, a slim volume of Rilke in his hand. He looked entirely at home among the chaos of words. "Just browsing," I managed to say. "Hoping for a happy accident." "The best kind of discovery," he agreed. "I find that manuscripts, much like people, often hide their best qualities in the most unassuming corners." His eyes held mine for a moment, and I knew he wasn't just talking about books. We spoke for nearly an hour, our voices low so as not to disturb the elderly proprietor. We talked about translation, about whether a poem could truly survive the journey from one language to another. He argued that it was an act of beautiful failure, while I contended it was an act of reincarnation. He didn't condescend or lecture. He listened, truly listened, and challenged my points with a fierce, joyful intelligence. It was like a game of chess, where every move was a new idea, a new way of seeing the world. When I finally left the shop, clutching a new book I couldn't afford but had bought anyway, just to have a reason for being there, I felt dizzy, with a kind of intellectual exhilaration I had never known. The world seemed sharper, more vibrant. He had not said a single word about my appearance, my family, or my sister. He had only spoken to me, to the person I kept hidden behind a wall of quiet observation. It was both terrifying and intoxicating. Caroline, of course, interpreted these sightings through her own unique lens. When I mentioned I had seen him in the village, she lit up. "Oh, wonderful. He's trying to get to me through you. It's a classic strategy for a shy man. He wants to learn my habits, my likes, my dislikes. Be a dear, Isabella, and be nice to him for my sake. Mention how much I adore roses and sunsets." I just nodded, the lie of omission, feeling heavy in my gut. What could I say? That he wasn't asking about her? That in our hour-long conversation, her name hadn't come up once? That he seemed to look at me and see not a conduit to a more beautiful woman, but a destination in and of itself? To say so would have been cruel, and worse, she wouldn't have believed me. Her entire identity was built on the foundation of being the desired one. To suggest otherwise would be to tell her the sky was green. The real turning point came a week later. I had sought refuge in a part of our estate that had been all but abandoned, the old, walled garden. It had once been my grandmother's pride, but now the roses grew wild, tangling with ivy, and the stone benches were covered in a soft green carpet of moss. It was a place of beautiful decay, a secret world. I was sitting on one of these benches, tracing the pattern of a snail's shell, when his shadow fell over me. "I had a feeling I might find you here," Douglas said, his voice quiet. "This place seems suited to you." "It's overlooked," I said without thinking. "People forget it exists. They prefer the manicured lawns at the front of the house." "The most beautiful things are often overlooked," he replied, sitting not next to me, but on the stone wall opposite, giving us space. "They don't shout for attention. You have to be willing to look for them." We stayed there for hours as the afternoon sun slanted through the overgrown branches. The conversation flowed more easily this time, moving from the abstract world of literature to the more treacherous terrain of our own lives. He spoke of his fame with a weariness that felt profound. He described it as a house of mirrors, where he was surrounded by countless reflections of himself, none of which were true. "They don't want me," he said, staring at a crumbling cherub on a nearby fountain. "They want the idea of me. The brooding poet, the tormented soul. They bring me their perfect polished surfaces, hoping to see their own reflection in my fame." I thought of Caroline, of her carefully constructed beauty, and a pang of sympathy, surprisingly, went through me. She was a victim of that same system, just on the other side of the mirror. Emboldened by his honesty, I found myself speaking of my own life with a frankness I rarely allowed myself. I told him what it was like to be the shadow, the quiet observer, in a family that prized spectacle. "There's a strange sort of freedom in it," I confessed, the words tasting foreign and true on my tongue. "When no one is looking at you, you're free to look at the world. You see things. You notice the details everyone else misses because they're too busy looking at each other." He was watching me with that same unnerving intensity from the woods, his dark eyes seeming to strip away every layer of self-doubt and reticence I had so carefully constructed. "Your mind," he said, his voice a low murmur. "It is a cathedral, full of stained glass and soaring arches and quiet corners where the truth sits, waiting to be discovered." My breath hitched. No one had ever said anything like that to me. I was used to being called sensible, clever, reliable, adjectives of utility. But a cathedral, that was something else entirely. It was a place of worship, of beauty, of profound and sacred complexity. It was the most beautiful compliment I had ever received, and it had nothing to do with my face, my body, or my name. It was for me. Only me. Before he left, as the light began to fade, he reached into the worn satchel he always carried and pulled out a sheaf of papers tied with a simple string. "I'm working on something new," he said, his voice hesitant for the first time. "It's personal, unfinished. I don't want praise. I don't want flattery. I want the truth. I was wondering if you would be willing to read it." He held it out to me. A manuscript, his work, his soul, bound in string. It was a gesture of trust, so immense it felt like a physical weight in my hands. "Of course," I whispered, my fingers trembling as I took it. That night, sleep was impossible. While the rest of the house was dark and silent, I sat in the circle of light from my small reading lamp, utterly consumed. The work was breathtaking. It was a long narrative poem, a modern epic that wove together myth and memory. It was about a king who builds a fortress of impossible beauty to protect a single perfect pearl, only to find that in his obsession to keep it safe, he has starved it of the ocean it needs to maintain its luster. The king's fortress, his love for the pearl, his slow dawning horror at what he had done, it was all there, rendered in language that was both brutal and sublime. It was unmistakably a masterpiece. But as I read it for the third time, a tiny dissonant note began to bother me. A single thread in the vast, intricate tapestry seemed out of place. The central metaphor, the fortress itself, was described with imagery of light and gold and polished surfaces, a gilded cage. It was powerful, but it felt dishonest. It didn't ring true with the raw, dark grief that pulsed beneath every other line of the poem. I knew with a sudden gut-wrenching certainty that the fortress wasn't a beautiful thing built from love. It was something else. I stayed up until the first gray light of dawn crept through my window, the pages spread around me like fallen leaves. I knew what I had to do. He had asked for the truth, and to give him anything less would be a betrayal of the trust he had placed in me, a betrayal of the cathedral he had seen inside my mind. I had to tell him that his masterpiece had a crack in its very foundation, and I was terrified that in doing so, I would bring the whole beautiful, impossible structure of our connection crashing down around me. The opportunity, or rather, the ordeal, presented itself 2 nights later. My parents, convinced that Douglas Thorne's continued presence in the area must eventually lead to a capitulation, decided to force the issue. They invited him to dinner. To everyone's astonishment, he accepted. The house was thrown into a frenzy of preparation. My mother planned a menu worthy of royalty, and Caroline spent the entire day in a flurry of gowns, perfumes, and hairstyles. She finally settled on a dress of emerald green silk that clung to her every curve and made her eyes sparkle like jewels. She was magnificent, a creature of myth. "Tonight is the night," she whispered to me, as I helped her fasten a diamond clasp at her throat. "I can feel it. He has finally worked up the courage." I felt a cold dread settle in my stomach. This dinner felt less like a social gathering and more like a public execution, though I wasn't sure who was the condemned. Douglas arrived precisely at 8. He was dressed in a simple, well-cut black suit that did little to conceal the restless energy simmering beneath the surface. He was polite, presenting my mother with a bottle of wine and complimenting the house with a detached grace. But from the moment he walked in, I could feel his discomfort. The drawing room, usually a comfortable space, felt like a cage. My father tried to engage him in talk of politics, which Douglas deflected with non-committal murmurs. My mother praised his work in gushing, general terms that made it clear she had never read a word of it. "Your poems are just so passionate," she exclaimed, "so full of deep feeling." He simply smiled, a tight, bloodless expression. And then there was Caroline. She was a whirlwind of charm, positioning herself near him at all times, touching his arm lightly as she laughed, her voice a musical cascade of anecdotes about her social triumphs in London, her favorite horses, her admiration for a particularly beautiful sunset she had witnessed the day before. She was performing the role of the perfect muse with dazzling skill, and Douglas Thorne watched her as if she were a fascinating but ultimately alien species. His eyes, however, kept finding mine across the room. In them, I saw a flicker of shared ordeal, a silent plea for rescue. It was a strange and powerful intimacy, forged in the crucible of my family's oblivious ambition. Dinner was an agonizing affair. Caroline dominated the conversation, steering it back to herself at every opportunity. I remained mostly silent, offering a quiet comment here and there, which my parents largely ignored. At one point, my father, in an attempt to flatter Douglas, turned to him and said, "You must find it all so inspiring, Thorne, a mind like yours, surrounded by all this beauty." He gestured vaguely at Caroline, who preened under the attention. Douglas's gaze flickered to me for a fraction of a second before he answered, his voice smooth as polished stone. "Beauty takes many forms, Mr. Abrams. Some are merely for the eye, others are for the soul." The remark sailed completely over my parents' and sisters' heads, but it landed in my heart like a thrown anchor. After dinner, as coffee was being served in the conservatory, I saw my chance. Caroline was momentarily occupied, showing my mother a photograph in a magazine. I slipped out into the moonlit garden, my heart hammering against my ribs. I knew he would follow. A minute later, he was there, standing beside a trellis of night-blooming jasmine, whose scent hung heavy in the air. "Thank you," he said, his voice low and strained. "For what?" "For the silence. For not performing." He let out a long breath. "Now, tell me, the manuscript. I saw you reading it by your window late last night. Don't spare me." This was it, the moment of truth. My hands felt cold. I took a deep breath, the scent of jasmine filling my lungs. "It's a work of genius," I began, my voice trembling slightly. "It's sublime. The story of the king and the pearl is heartbreaking." "But," he prompted, his eyes fixed on my face, unblinking in the moonlight. "But the fortress," I said, forcing the words out. "You describe it as a gilded cage, a thing of beauty, built from a misguided love, polished gold, shimmering surfaces, light." "Yes," he said, "a prison of beauty." "I don't believe you," I whispered. He stiffened. "What?" "I don't believe you believe it. The grief in the poem, the king's despair, it's too real, too dark. It doesn't come from a place of light and gold. The fortress he built wasn't beautiful. It wasn't a monument to a precious thing. It was a bunker, a stronghold. It was built of fear." I took a step closer, my terror giving way to a strange, fierce certainty. I wasn't just talking about the poem anymore. I was talking to him. "You write of a king caging a pearl, but it feels like you're writing about a man caging his own heart. The fortress isn't gilded. It's made of shadows, of silence. It's built from the fear of being truly seen, of being known and then abandoned. The flaw in the poem isn't the language. It's a single, subtle act of dishonesty. You're hiding the truth of the fortress from the reader, because I think you're still hiding it from yourself." I finished, gasping for air, my entire body shaking. The silence that followed was absolute, deeper than the quiet of the woods, more profound than the hush of a library. The only sound was the frantic beating of my own heart. Douglas stared at me, his face pale in the moonlight, his expression utterly stripped bare. He looked shocked, wounded, and then, slowly, miraculously, a look of profound, earth-shattering understanding dawned in his eyes. He had asked for the truth, and I had given him a piece of his own soul that he hadn't known was missing. It was at that precise, suspended moment that the glass door to the conservatory slid open. Caroline glided out, a triumphant smile on her face, my parents trailing behind her like attendants. "There you are," she chirped, her voice jarring in the sacred quiet. "Douglas, darling, we were just saying, you must come and visit us in London this autumn." She reached him and, with a proprietary air, tucked her arm through his. She looked from his stunned face to my terrified one, and a flicker of smug pity crossed her features. She thought he had followed me out here, to let me down gently. She thought she was rescuing him. "Isn't he wonderful?" she said to no one in particular, tightening her grip on his arm. "We've had such lovely chats. I feel we have a true connection." Douglas did not look at her. He seemed to come back to himself from a great distance. Slowly, with a deliberation that was almost painful to watch, he reached up and gently, unequivocally, removed her hand from his arm. He let it drop. Then, he turned his head and looked directly at me. His voice, when he spoke, was not loud, but it cut through the night air with the clarity of a ringing bell, a pronouncement for all to hear. "Miss Abrams," he said, his eyes still locked on mine, but his words addressed to the beautiful, bewildered woman beside him. "Your sister, Caroline. Her beauty is remarkable. It is a perfect sonnet written on a rose petal. It is flawless, and the world is right to admire it." Caroline beamed, her victory seemingly assured. Douglas took a small step away from her, a step closer to me. "But you must understand," he continued, his voice dropping to a register of raw, undeniable sincerity. "Your sister, Isabella," he said my name like it was a revelation. "She is the epic, she is the library, she is the journey, the discovery and the truth. She is the one I have been searching for my entire life." The silence in the garden was no longer peaceful. It was a vacuum, sucking all the air and sound out of the world. My mother's hand flew to her mouth, my father's jaw was slack, and Caroline, the look on her face, was one of utter, shattering incomprehension. Her perfect, ordered world, the one that had operated on a single, simple rule, had just been publicly, irrevocably dismantled. And in its place, in the center of the rubble, stood me, the footnote, the shadow, the epic. The immediate aftermath was a storm of exquisitely awkward silence, followed by a chaotic retreat. My parents mumbled their goodnights to Douglas, their faces masks of confusion and social horror. Caroline didn't say a word. She simply turned, her emerald dress rustling like angry leaves, and swept back into the house. Douglas's eyes met mine one last time over their retreating shoulders. He gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod, a promise and an apology all in one, before taking his leave. I remained in the garden for a long time, my arms wrapped around myself, the scent of jasmine suddenly overwhelming. His words echoed in the quiet. "She is the epic." It was as if someone had turned on a light in a room I had lived in my entire life, revealing colors and dimensions I never knew existed. I felt seen, not just noticed, but profoundly, fundamentally seen. When I finally went back inside, the storm broke. Caroline was in the drawing room, her magnificent dress, now looking like a costume, for a part she had failed to win. Her beautiful face was twisted with rage and disbelief. "What did you do?" she hissed, her voice trembling. "What did you say to him?" My mother and father stood behind her, their expressions a mixture of anger and bewilderment. They were looking at me as if I were a stranger, a cuckoo in their nest. "I didn't do anything," I said, my voice quiet but steady. It was the truth. I had simply been myself. "Don't lie to me," Caroline cried, taking a step toward me. "He was meant for me. Everyone knew it. You deliberately undermined me. You schemed, you plotted, you poisoned him against me with your books and your quiet little judgments." For the first time in my life, faced with her fury, I didn't shrink, I didn't apologize, I didn't try to soothe her. I felt a strange, calm strength settle over me. "He wasn't meant for you, Caroline," I said, my voice even. "He was never looking for what you were offering. It wasn't a competition. You can't win a person." "Isabella, that is enough," my father interjected, his voice stern. "You have embarrassed your sister. You have embarrassed this family. I don't know what game you are playing, but it will stop." It was the accusation of playing a game that finally broke through my calm. "A game?" I asked, my voice rising with an incredulity that bordered on laughter. "You think this is a game? For 28 years, I have watched you both worship at the altar of Caroline's beauty. Her every whim was catered to, her every success celebrated. I was the sensible furniture, the reliable backdrop for her starring role. I never complained. I never asked for more. I found my own world, a world you never once bothered to look into. And now, someone from the outside, a man you admire, has glanced into that world and found something of value, and you accuse me of embarrassing you? You are not embarrassed by my actions. You are embarrassed because your worldview has been contradicted. The hierarchy you built has been challenged, and you cannot bear it." The room fell silent. My parents stared at me, shocked. They had never heard me speak like this. Frankly, neither had I. Caroline just looked broken. The anger had drained out of her, leaving behind a hollow, desolate confusion. She had been the sun, and she had just discovered that someone preferred the stars. I didn't wait for a response. I turned and walked out of the room, up the stairs to my own bedroom, and closed the door. I didn't feel triumphant. I just felt free. The next day, a note arrived from the cottage. It was delivered by a local boy and addressed simply to Isabella. My mother eyed it with deep suspicion as she handed it to me. The note contained only one line, written in a strong, dark script. "The fortress has fallen. Come and see the ruins." I walked to his cottage with a strange sense of purpose. The path through the woods felt different now, not an escape, but a destination. When he opened the door, the awkwardness that I had feared was not there. He looked tired, but a profound peace had settled in his features. The cottage was a chaotic mess of books and papers, a testament to a mind in constant motion. He led me to a small wooden table where 2 cups of tea were steaming. "I was up all night," he said, gesturing to a fresh stack of papers covered in furiously scribbled ink. "I started over. You were right. The dishonesty was a poison. I was writing about fear, so I had to call it fear." He looked at me, his gaze direct and open. "Thank you, Isabella, not just for your insight into my work, but for your courage. It cannot have been easy for you last night." "It wasn't," I admitted, "but it was necessary." "Yes," he said, "it was." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, sipping our tea. The air between us was clear, clean. There were no games, no pretenses. Then he put his cup down and reached across the table, his hand covering mine. His touch was warm, steady. "I meant what I said last night. All of it. I am not a man for casual flirtations or simple courtships. My life is complicated, and my mind is a noisy place. But it would be a quieter, better place with you in it. If you would let me," he was asking, formally, humbly. This brilliant, celebrated man was asking permission to enter my world. Later, before I left, he picked up a single sheet of paper from his desk. "I wrote something else last night," he said, a faint flush on his cheeks. "After the other work was done. It's for you." He cleared his throat and began to read. It was a poem. It wasn't about my eyes, or my hair, or the curve of my smile. It was about the geography of my mind. It spoke of the courage of quiet and the architecture of thought. He described my insight as a lantern in a labyrinth. It was the most intimate, most breathtakingly beautiful thing anyone had ever created for me. I listened, tears streaming down my face, not from sadness, but from a joy so profound it was painful. He wasn't praising a muse he had placed on a pedestal. He was speaking to an equal, a partner, a soul he had recognized as his own. In his small, book-cluttered cottage, surrounded by the beautiful ruins of his old poem, we began to build something new, something honest, and something that was entirely our own. We were married a year later, in a small, quiet ceremony, near the coast where Douglas had bought a house. It was a windswept, beautiful place, perched on a cliff overlooking the sea, a fortress not of fear, but of peace. Our life together settled into a rhythm that was as natural as the tides. It was a life of shared silence and vibrant conversation, of long walks on the beach and evenings spent reading by the fire. I discovered that I had a talent for editing, for seeing the structure beneath the words, and I soon became his most trusted reader, his creative collaborator. My name began to appear in the acknowledgments of his books, not as a muse, but as a partner. For Isabella, my editor, my epic, my home, the world, which had once been so fascinated by Douglas's solitude, was now fascinated by our partnership. Magazine articles were written, speculating on the plain woman who had captured the heart of the great poet. They printed unflattering pictures of me alongside glamorous shots of Caroline, creating a narrative of baffling choice. At first, it stung. But with Douglas by my side, their opinions became distant noise. He never defended me publicly. He didn't need to. His respect for me was evident in every word he published, in the way he looked at me across a crowded room. He didn't need to tell the world my worth. He showed me, every day, and that was all that mattered. My family's reaction was a slow, reluctant evolution. For the first year, my parents were cold and distant. They treated my marriage as a strange aberration, a temporary madness. They could not comprehend a world where substance had triumphed over style. But Douglas's fame did not wane. If anything, his work grew deeper, richer, and his reputation solidified into that of a living legend. Gradually, grudgingly, their attitude began to thaw. They could not understand the connection, but they understood success. It was Caroline who surprised me. The humiliation of that night had acted as a harsh but necessary catalyst in her life. Stripped of her primary weapon, the certainty of her own irresistible beauty, she had been forced to look for other tools. She stopped trying to be a muse and started trying to be a person. She took up gardening, finding a passion for cultivating life from the soil. She volunteered at a local animal shelter. She read books, not as props but as portals. 2 years after my wedding, she married a kind, quiet veterinarian who seemed to love her not for her flawless face, but for her newfound, tentative kindness. She invited Douglas and me to her small country wedding. During the reception, she pulled me aside, her hands stained with a little bit of dirt from her own bouquet. "I owe you an apology, Isabella," she said, her gaze steady and for the first time, clear of artifice. "I was awful to you. I was so convinced that the world was a mirror, I never thought to look through the window. You were happy for me, my whole life, and I couldn't be happy for you for one evening. I am sorry." It wasn't a perfect apology, and it didn't magically erase a lifetime of being overlooked, but it was real. It was a start. "I'm happy for you, Caroline," I said, and I meant it. We watched her new husband make her laugh, a genuine, unpracticed sound, and I felt a sense of peace settle between us. We would never be close in the way some sisters were, but we were no longer just a sun and its shadow. We were two different plants, finally growing in our own light. One afternoon, about 5 years into our marriage, Douglas was struggling with a new piece. He had been pacing the length of his study for days, wrestling with a poem that refused to yield. He was blocked, frustrated, and had retreated into a shell of silence. The old Douglas, the one before me, might have languished there for months. I watched him for a while, then went to the kitchen and made him a pot of tea and a plate of toast, just the way he liked it. I brought it into the study and set it down on his desk, right on top of the problematic stanza. He looked up, his eyes stormy. "I can't work," he growled. "I know," I said calmly, "so don't. Let's go for a walk. The tide is out." He started to protest, but I just stood there, waiting. After a moment, the tension went out of his shoulders. He nodded, and we walked out of the house, leaving the poem behind. We walked for miles along the wet sand, not talking about work, but about silly things, the shape of the clouds, a dog chasing a piece of driftwood, what we should have for dinner. When we came back hours later, chilled by the sea air, but relaxed, he walked into his study, looked at the page, picked up his pen, and crossed out the entire stanza. He started again, and the words began to flow. He didn't thank me, not with words, but later that night, as we sat reading, he reached out and took my hand. "My compass," he said softly. It was then that I truly understood the nature of our connection. I was not his muse. A muse is a passive thing, an object of beauty to be observed and translated into art. I was his partner. I was his editor, his critic, his confidante, and his friend. I was the anchor that allowed his kite to soar. I wasn't the subject of the art. I was part of the process of its creation. Being beautiful was never my destiny, but being seen, truly and completely, was, and I came to realize that being plain had been a strange and unexpected gift. It forced me to cultivate an inner world so rich and vibrant that when someone finally took the time to step inside, they found something far more captivating than a pretty face. They found a cathedral. Looking back on it all now, from the quiet comfort of this house by the sea, the lessons from that summer are as clear and constant as the lighthouse beam that sweeps across our window each night. I learned that the world will often try to hand you a label, to put you in a box that is easy for others to understand. The plain one, the smart one, the pretty one. But you are never just one thing. You are the epic, you are the entire library, and the most important journey you will ever take is the one to discover all the volumes written within you. True connection, the kind that anchors your soul, is rarely about the surface. It's not about finding someone who admires your cover. It's about finding someone who wants to read every single page, who cherishes the footnotes and